it is really amazing how many really sophisticated, owners and operators of buildings actually don't really know the current systems in all their buildings, right? So they might not know where they'll need replacements. And as a result, capital planning for those buildings tends to be more reactive. Things like implementing decarbonization programs tends to be higher cost than it needs to be.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Our guest today is Brodie Boland, co-founder and CEO of Upgraid. This innovative startup's mission is to use machine learning and big data to fix the manual, slow, and often expensive process of selling and planning building upgrades. With buildings responsible for more than a quarter of global emissions, Upgraid promises to compress timelines from months to days and change the way building upgrade providers identify opportunities, prepare proposals, and accelerate retrofits. Our conversation will explore the innovation behind the technology, the market opportunity, and the potential to unlock emissions reductions. Brodie, welcome to the show and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Excited to be here.
Brodie, why don't we start just talking about your career journey? Can you tell us what led you to start and be the CEO of Upgrade?
Yeah, so I've always been very passionate about sustainability. I spent the last 15 years or so at McKinsey and Company as a consultant and advisor, and helped start and then lead our energy and sustainability practice in the built environment. So spent a bunch of my time working with big owners of buildings, infrastructure, the service providers to those buildings and infrastructure, and the technology ecosystem around that. Really through that work, observed one of the facts that you described in the introduction, which is that buildings drive a significant portion of global emissions. And I think really importantly, they're also a sector in which it is possible to address those emissions with today's technology and largely with today's economics. And so seeing that opportunity is what led us to go deeper into it and eventually start Upgrade.
So tell us more about the opportunity itself and what exactly is Upgrade intending to solve, and why did you create the company and see that there's a need for the services you provide?
Number one, as you said, buildings drive significant share of emissions in the built environment. But the process of upgrading buildings, so we have the technology we need to upgrade buildings, right? We have heat pumps, we have automation systems, we have lighting. A lot of the emissions that come from operating buildings can be addressed with today's technology. Now, that's very different if we're talking about construction of buildings. The technological hurdles and the economic hurdles with green steel and cement are a very different challenge. But as far as operating buildings, we know what it takes. We know what the technologies are. We know how to make the economics work. But the actual market for building upgrades is incredibly archaic. If you are a building owner, I've worked with many of them. In many cases, even the building owners, the folks that own and operate portfolios, don't know the systems that are in their buildings. They might not know what kind of heating or cooling system they have. They might not know the extent to which they've upgraded the lighting or installed building control systems. They might not know the insulation behind the walls or under the roof of their building. And so the information about the current state, for starters, is very patchy. Second, getting better information about that is a highly manual process. So often it requires, in the current state, it requires getting an energy auditor on site, they kind of going up on the roof and looking at nameplates of systems. They're trying to look behind the walls and seeing insulation levels. It's a very manual process. And this has just put gum in the works of building upgrades, right? It makes everything more challenging because there isn't visibility into what's the current state of buildings are. And as a result, there isn't visibility into what's needed to upgrade them. And so we have a situation where hundreds of millions of buildings out there, a huge opportunity to decarbonize them, a huge opportunity to improve the economic efficiency, the health of the places we live and work. But those upgrades just aren't getting done. And so that is the fundamental challenge we're trying to address.
In terms of building owners, what are the economic benefits of doing this kind of work? You already touched upon some of them, but beyond the sustainability benefit, it seems like there's a really strong business case in many circumstances to do this kind of work. Beyond the one you just mentioned, what are some of the economic benefits?
The economic benefits largely come down to savings on the utility bill. Now, there are certainly others, but many of these measures, especially with shifting energy price environments, simply mean that you pay a lower utility bill for things like LEDs, for things like automation and controls of building systems. Those often pay back simply through savings on the utility bill in a relatively short period of time. Now, there are other technologies, things like heat pumps and improving insulation and so on, that may take a little longer to pay back, and that may differ depending on the energy price environment and depending on the local climate and technologies and the building control or the building conditions. But again, even in those cases, we find that in many, many buildings, those cover the cost of installing those technologies in a reasonable period of time, and so are just worthwhile investments. Now, there's a whole bunch of additional benefits, things like, in some cases, reducing operating costs of the building, with more efficient systems, with more modernized systems, with things like automated controls of building systems. You can reduce the time, the effort, the cost it takes to operate a building. In other cases, for certain segments of buildings, the owner can get a premium on their lease rate. So, for example, if you have a important office tenant in your office building that is trying to attract top talent and has some type of commitment to decarbonization, then providing a lower emissions building can often capture a green premium. That shifts in some markets. There's a whole bunch of variability there, but in many cases, that is something that can be achieved. And then there are other benefits in certain markets, just meeting local regulatory standards, avoiding penalties, et cetera. But when you kind of stack all of those benefits up, in many cases, the upgrade's paid for just by saving on the utility bill. And in other cases, some of those other benefits can either increase the upside of that upgrade or allow it to meet an economic threshold that makes sense getting done.
Of course, building upgrades have been happening for a long time. What is the upgrade solution, and what are you doing that hasn't been done before that helps to facilitate that process?
So the fundamental problem we are trying to solve is a lack of information on the part both of the owner of the building and the provider of upgrades to buildings around which buildings would most benefit from upgrades. So there are hundreds of millions of buildings out there, and some do benefit and do need upgrades, and upgrades to those buildings will yield economic benefits and health benefits and environmental benefits, and other buildings don't. And so the problem is that both for an owner and for an upgrade provider, and when I talk about upgrade providers, I mean the folks that are installing a new heating and cooling system, or the folks that are installing a new roof or new control systems or new lights, they are both, because of the lack of this information, searching for a bunch of needles in a very large haystack. And so if we can help both the owners and the upgrade providers rapidly identify those buildings that need upgrades, spend far less time figuring out what upgrades those buildings require, and much more immediately get just to delivering and installing the actual new systems, then our view is that we will bend the curve on the pace of decarbonization of the built environment.
So, Brodie, how does the platform work?
So the Upgrade platform does two things. Thing one is we understand the building. And so we pipe in hundreds of data sets from everything ranging from satellites to local permitting data, thermal imaging of buildings, building envelope data, energy models, et cetera. And we can understand the current systems in the building, things like what's the HVAC system? What's the capacity of that system? What are the thermal properties of that building? When was the roof last installed? And what is the insulation quality of the roof? So understanding the current systems in the building and understanding the energy dynamics and financial dynamics as a result of those current systems. So how much energy are they consuming? What are they paying for the utility bill? So thing one is really getting a really clear picture for every building and what the current state of the systems are, what the economics of those systems are. Thing two is we build a bunch of context around that building. Who owns it? Who operates it? What is the financial profile of the owner operator? Do they have an incentive to upgrade the building? Do they have the money to upgrade the building? Who would the decision makers be? And we put those two pieces of information in the hands of the providers of building upgrades so that they can better target buildings that would actually benefit from an upgrade instead of spending a ton of time showing up buildings that may have already just been upgraded and don't actually need anything done. So they can be more prepared for their conversations with the owners and operators of those buildings. And so they can ultimately accelerate their sales process through scoping an upgrade, through developing a proposal, financing those upgrades, and ultimately just reduce the overall transaction costs and burden required in upgrading buildings.
How do you evaluate the financial aspects of these retrofits in terms of the costs and the economics? Do you take into consideration things like government funding or incentives that would be available to do the work?
Precisely, Michael. We look both at the kind of physical reality of the building and what's required in the building and what the scope would be and what the project would be. And then we also look at, what would it cost to do that in that local market? What would the benefits be given the local utility costs and the relative costs of, for example, energy and natural gas? We look at what would the incentives be that are available to the owner or operator of that building? What would the financing structure of that upgrade be? And what would the cost of that capital be to either the upgrade provider or to the owner? So we really try and create a full holistic picture of the fundamental economics of a building upgrade. And our belief is really that there are enough upgrades out there that can decarbonize buildings that make economic sense, that the challenge is finding those upgrades that make economic sense and just executing them seamlessly with the existing financing available, with the existing financing structures available, rather than trying to make numbers work that don't.
What kind of technology are you using for this, Brodie? Are you using AI or other types of tools?
We are definitely using AI. I think we're using two broad categories of AI. So the fundamental model that we've built and that is understanding building conditions is using machine learning. It is not generative AI. It is designed to create non-hallucinatory, reliable views of individual idiosyncratic buildings, right? And that's where we draw in the data from satellites and data from permitting databases and data from all kinds of different sources to create that understanding of the building conditions. We also do use generative AI. We use it in a couple of ways. One is we use it to process a range of inputs from different sources to compare and check our machine learning models. So for example, if the satellite view of a building says, here's the type of rooftop unit on this building, we use some of the generative AI capabilities, the LLMs, to say, okay, is there anything that disagrees with this? Are you seeing a permit that actually looks like it's different than what our satellite observation? So we can kind of create internal checks within the model. And then the second way that we're using LLMs is to present the outputs of the work we do in language that can be read by humans. The machine learning is doing it in a kind of very quantitative fashion, and someone who's about to show up with a customer and wants to tell them what kind of upgrades they need needs to be able to read it in real words. And so we use the LLMs as a post-processing step after the machine learning to create outputs that are understandable, intelligible by humans.
Can you elaborate on the use cases? You suggested a couple that are currently being used or how the platform is being used. What other use cases do you see either now or in the future for the platform?
So our immediate use case right now is we are looking for, and there's a few horizons of this, right? We are looking just to dramatically improve the targeting and efficiency of building upgrade sales. So if you're a salesperson, trying to sell a roof replacement, in the most simple example, we help you focus all your time on buildings that actually need a new roof, right? So targeting, there's more complex versions of that with upgrades that require more creative financing and incentive structures and include more components of the building. But fundamentally, use case number one is spend your time where there's actually going to be a potential return on investment to you and to that building owner. Use case two is we help you show up to that first meeting with the building owner, actually knowing something about the building. So in many cases right now, the folks that are selling these building upgrades will show up, to be glib, will show up with their brochure and say, here's what we do. Would you like a building upgrade? And often the owner of the building kind of shrugs and says, I don't know. And the building upgrade provider then in the best case scenario has to spend the next several weeks inside the building, understanding the current systems in that building in a really manual way. And so with Upgrade, they can show up to that first meeting already with a pretty clear understanding of what that building requires. So their first conversation with the building owner is, here's what we think you might need. Here's what the scope of that would be. Here's what the financial return on that would be. So a much more successful set of first conversations with the building owner. A third use case we're working on right now is then incorporating additional data from the building to refine that proposal and accelerate the time to actually putting, so to speak, shovels in the ground, right? Or an RTU on the roof. So for example, if once the upgrade provider is in conversation with the building owner, they get a utility bill, or they walk around the building and get some pictures, or they have some notes on the condition of the facility from the building owner, they can simply upload that into the Upgrade platform. We interpret all that information and update our digital view of the building and the economics of an upgrade and even the text of the ultimate proposal. So it essentially just saves time for that upgrade provider in doing their feasibility analyses of the building and in ultimately agreeing on a piece of work with the owner of the building. So right now, that's what we're focused on, is really accelerating that whole sales process. And our objective is we just make it easier for the owners, and we make it easier for the upgrade providers, and we make it easier for everyone to find building upgrades that actually make sense. Right. In the future, we're really excited about a range of other applications. So for example, if you are lending to or buying or selling a building, it's often helpful information to know, is this building going to require $1 million upgrade just after I buy it? What is the actual performance of this building from, for example, an emissions perspective or an energy perspective? And how should that impact the price I'm willing to pay for this building? Or even with an existing portfolio, how do I really quickly get an understanding of all the systems and all the buildings to create a solid capital inventory? So there's a whole range of additional applications that we're thinking of beyond this first horizon. But right now, we're laser focused on helping upgrade providers find buildings that make sense to upgrade and have much more effective conversations with the owners of those buildings.
What about financial institutions like pension funds or asset managers or even banks? Is there any application for them to use this kind of tool?
Absolutely. I spent a fair amount of my last, 10 years working with big investors in buildings, lenders to buildings. And because of just the nature of owning and operating buildings, and because of the lack of these kind of tools in the past, it is really amazing how many really sophisticated, owners and operators of buildings actually don't really know the current systems in all their buildings, right? So they might not know where they'll need replacements. And as a result, capital planning for those buildings tends to be more reactive. Things like implementing decarbonization programs tends to be higher cost than it needs to be. Things like reporting on emissions footprints and so on can often be challenging. Now, there are a lot of really great startups and companies that are working in this space, and we see some of the technologies that we're able to provide in terms of identifying current systems within buildings and understanding the economics of that really rapidly, feeding into that ecosystem and overall, hopefully contributing to making it much easier for owners, investors, lenders of buildings to manage their portfolios more effectively.
So you made quite a big jump, Brodie, from being a partner at McKinsey and working with all of these big companies to starting your own company. Where are you in that business journey?
Overwhelmed, Michael. No, it's been really, really exciting. I had a wonderful time at McKinsey and really grateful for my time there. And yeah, this is really different, right? We are still new, but we are moving really quickly. We have done our first fundraising round. We have a handful of customers that are really excited about the product and are dramatically increasing usage, even on a week by week basis. It's really fun to watch the numbers go up of the folks using our platform. And it's particularly, as you can imagine, reassuring and encouraging for my team and I to see the feedback we get from our customers, right? And they're saying, you're helping us sell, right? You're helping us increase our revenue. You're helping us upgrade buildings.
Brodie, in terms of specific applications, are there any examples that you can give of how you've worked with companies to help implement your tool and streamline these processes?
One example, we're working with a large company that does building upgrades. They also manufacture and sell the equipment for building upgrades. And they do a lot of work in performance contracting, which is essentially, we'll do the upgrade and we'll finance the upgrade and we'll get paid back from the energy savings you have on an ongoing basis. And right now, their sales process has been really intensive. A lot of time that their salespeople spend trying to research their customers and show up to their meetings with their customers with even just a little bit of information. They now use us for every meeting preparation. Every time one of their salespeople goes out to a customer, they get an upgrade report. They read that report. They print off components of that report, and they show up to those customers with those components and are able to leave it behind on their desk. Here's the upgrades that the different buildings in your portfolio requires. Here's the economics of those. Here's some of the incentives that are available to you and that you can easily get. And so it's really helped their first stage of their sales process. They're also using Upgrade for the estimating the feasibility of the economics of upgrading the building. So previously, they would spend weeks and sometimes months gathering data from a building, trying to figure out if the math works, trying to figure out if they can finance it. Now they go in with a pretty clear view of that, and with a few select data collection, or by collecting a few select pieces of data, they can rapidly update that view and get a sense of, does this make economic sense? And then finally, they've started to use it to do more creative things. For example, things like being able to respond to requests for proposal that are out there in their sector for building upgrades in a far less time-intensive way. So because they can understand the whole building portfolio, they can automatically create the economics of the upgrade, they can customize their own content to the requirements of the RFP, they can now respond to 10 times the number of RFPs that they were responding to before. So I think in each of those, we see some of the clues as to how this market is going to shift over time, right? As you have much more informed buyers and sellers, as you have a much more compressed process of those buyers and sellers interacting, and as you have the automation of some parts of the process of buying and selling building upgrades, each of those is kind of a signpost to where this market is heading.
Well, it sounds very exciting, Brodie. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.